The Charleston County records of 1847 contain an entry that most historians have overlooked. Filed between routine plantation inventories and shipping manifests lies a single-page document bearing the seal of the county coroner. The paper describes the discovery of what officials termed structural irregularities at Magnolia Grove Plantation, owned by one Silas Beauregard. The document mentions measurements, architectural inconsistencies, and the phrase sealed chambers of unknown purpose. No follow-up investigation was recorded. Silas Beauregard arrived in Charleston in 1838, purchasing 800 acres of rice fields along the Ashley River. Local records describe him as a widower from Virginia, though no marriage certificate or death record for his supposed wife has ever been found. He brought with him 43 enslaved individuals and enough capital to immediately begin expanding the plantation's quarters. Neighbors noted his unusual attention to construction details, particularly regarding the slave quarters he ordered built in 1839. The quarters themselves drew attention from the start. Unlike the typical single-room cabins common to the region, Beauregard's structures featured double walls, unusually thick foundations, and windows that faced inward toward a central courtyard rather than outward toward the fields. Local carpenter Samuel Morrison, whose ledger survived in the Charleston Historical Society archives, recorded receiving specific instructions about interior measurements that seemed to contradict the building's external dimensions. Morrison noted that Beauregard insisted on personal supervision of certain construction phases, dismissing workers during what he called precision installations. The people who lived in these quarters rarely spoke to outsiders, even by the standards of the time. Plantation records show that Beauregard acquired most of his workforce through private sales rather than public auctions, often traveling to distant ports to personally select individuals. A letter from 1841, found in the papers of neighboring planter William Drayton, mentions Beauregard's preference for purchasing unaccompanied adults with no local connections. This practice, while not illegal, struck other planters as unusually deliberate. Daily life at Magnolia Grove followed patterns that distinguished it from neighboring plantations. Work began before dawn and continued past sunset, but with extended midday breaks when workers were required to return to their quarters. During these periods, which lasted up to 3 hours, no one was permitted in the fields or near the main house. A former overseer named Marcus Webb, whose testimony appears in an 1868 deposition related to property disputes, recalled being explicitly forbidden from approaching the quarters during these breaks. Webb described hearing sounds during these times, rhythmic tapping, scraping, and what he characterized as shuffling footsteps that seemed to come from below ground level. The layout of the quarters formed a perfect rectangle with 8 buildings arranged around a central yard. Each structure housed between 5 and 8 individuals, but the internal arrangements defied conventional understanding. According to building permits filed with Charleston County, each cabin measured 20 feet by 30 feet. However, measurements taken during the 1847 investigation revealed interior spaces of only 16 feet by 26 feet. The missing dimensions were never accounted for. Beauregard's behavior grew increasingly erratic during the winter of 1846. Local physician Dr. Eugene Moreau, whose practice records are housed at the Medical University of South Carolina, documented multiple house calls to Magnolia Grove during this period. Dr. Moreau noted that Beauregard suffered from severe insomnia, frequent headaches, and what the physician described as an obsessive preoccupation with sounds originating from beneath his residence. The doctor prescribed laudanum, but Beauregard reportedly refused to take it during daylight hours, claiming he needed to maintain vigilance. The first official indication that something was amiss came in March of 1847. Charleston County Sheriff Robert Pinckney received a complaint from neighboring planter Thomas Middleton regarding disturbances emanating from Magnolia Grove during the early morning hours. Middleton's written statement, preserved in county archives, describes sounds of systematic excavation beginning around 4 o'clock each morning and continuing until dawn. When Pinckney visited Beauregard to investigate, he was told that the sounds resulted from foundation repairs necessitated by flooding damage. No evidence of recent flooding was visible. 2 weeks later, a county tax assessor, James Rhett, arrived for the annual property evaluation. Rhett's report, filed in April 1847, noted significant discrepancies in the plantation's declared improvements. Specifically, Rhett observed that the slave quarters appeared to have been modified extensively since the previous year's assessment, with new masonry work evident around the foundations. More puzzling was Rhett's discovery of what he termed ventilation systems of unusual complexity running beneath the buildings. These consisted of brick-lined channels that appeared to connect all 8 structures in a network extending toward the main house. During this same period, several enslaved individuals from neighboring plantations reported encounters that they described to their owners, who subsequently documented these accounts in personal correspondence. Elizabeth Pringle, wife of planter John Julius Pringle, wrote to her sister in April 1847 about troubling reports from their workers. According to Mrs. Pringle's letter, individuals who had attempted to visit friends at Magnolia Grove returned with stories of locked doors during daylight hours. The smell of damp earth and decay permeating the quarters, and the sound of voices speaking in whispers from what seemed to be underground spaces. The situation escalated in early May when a young woman named Sarah, enslaved at the neighboring Boone Hall plantation, failed to return from an arranged visit to Magnolia Grove. Her absence was reported to Charleston authorities by Boone Hall's owner, Major John Boone, who had granted permission for the visit. When Sheriff Pinckney arrived at Magnolia Grove to inquire about Sarah's whereabouts, Beauregard claimed she had never arrived. A search of the plantation grounds revealed no trace of the woman, though searchers noted that several areas around the quarters showed signs of recent digging. Dr. Moreau visited Magnolia Grove again on May 15th, summoned by Beauregard's increasingly erratic state. The physician's notes from this visit, discovered in 1892 during renovation of his former office, describe Beauregard as consumed by fears of discovery and speaking repeatedly of sounds from below that prevented sleep. Most significantly, Dr. Moreau noted that Beauregard had developed a severe aversion to approaching the slave quarters, claiming that proximity to the buildings caused him physical discomfort. The physician prescribed stronger sedatives, but noted his growing concern about his patient's mental state. The investigation that would eventually expose the truth began on May 22nd, when Charleston County Coroner William Gibbies received an anonymous letter directing him to Magnolia Grove. The letter, written in careful script but lacking any identifying marks, contained specific instructions to examine the foundations beneath the quarters and measure the interior spaces against official records. While the letter's author was never identified, handwriting analysis conducted in 1898 suggested it was written by someone with formal education, possibly a clerk or professional with access to county records. Coroner Gibbies arrived at Magnolia Grove on May 24th, accompanied by Sheriff Pinckney and County Surveyor Frederick Rutledge. Beauregard initially refused them entry to the quarters, claiming that the residents were suffering from a contagious fever that posed a public health risk. However, when pressed to produce medical documentation of this claimed outbreak, Beauregard could provide none. Dr. Moreau, when consulted, confirmed that he had treated no one at the plantation for fever or any other contagious condition. The formal inspection began the following morning. Using county records and the original building plans filed by Carpenter Morrison, Surveyor Rutledge confirmed the discrepancies in measurements that had first raised suspicion during tax assessor Rhett's visit. Each building showed interior dimensions significantly smaller than its external footprint suggested. More disturbing was the discovery that the floors of several cabins had been modified. Original pine planking had been replaced with thick oak boards that showed evidence of frequent removal and replacement. Beneath these boards, the inspection team found not the expected earth foundation, but carefully constructed brick chambers extending several feet underground. The chambers formed a network of interconnected spaces running beneath the entire quarters complex. Each underground room measured approximately 8 feet by 12 feet, with heights varying between 4 and 6 feet. The chambers were lined with brick and mortar of professional quality, featuring drainage systems that channeled water away from the spaces. Most puzzling was the discovery of iron rings embedded in the walls of each chamber, positioned at heights that suggested they were intended to restrain individuals in standing or sitting positions. Evidence of recent occupation was unmistakable. The chambers contained straw bedding, wooden buckets for waste, and what appeared to be feeding implements. Several chambers showed scratches in the brick walls, forming patterns that suggested prolonged confinement. In one underground space, investigators found a collection of small personal items, hair ribbons, buttons, and fragments of cloth that appeared to have been torn from clothing. Most significantly, they discovered a wooden board bearing carved initials and names, including SM and April 1847, which corresponded to the time frame when Sarah had disappeared. Beauregard was present during the initial discovery, but fled the plantation before investigators could question him thoroughly. He was found 3 days later in a Charleston boarding house, in what witnesses described as a state of complete mental collapse. When arrested, he spoke incoherently about necessary containment and protecting the larger investment. In his possession were detailed records, written in his own hand, documenting what appeared to be a systematic program of concealment and control that had operated for nearly 8 years. These records, which were sealed by court order but partially quoted in subsequent legal proceedings, revealed the true purpose of the underground chambers. Beauregard had constructed them to house individuals who were meant to remain invisible to outside inspection. The records indicated that at least 30 people had been confined in these spaces over the years, with many subsequently transported to distant locations through arrangements with ship captains operating from private docks along the Ashley River. The records also contained references to payments received from parties as far away as Cuba and Brazil, suggesting that Beauregard's operation served as a processing station for illegal human trafficking. The discovery of Sarah's personal effects led to an extensive search of the plantation grounds. Working in teams, investigators and volunteer searchers examined every structure and excavated numerous areas that showed signs of disturbance. Behind the main house, they found a depression that had been recently filled with loose earth. Excavation of this site revealed the remains of at least 12 individuals, buried without coffins or markers. The condition of the remains suggested that they had died during the previous 2 years. County Coroner Gibbies conducted examinations of the recovered remains, documenting evidence of prolonged malnutrition, untreated injuries, and what he described as marks consistent with restraint. His official report, filed in June 1847, concluded that the deaths resulted from systematic neglect and deliberate harm, rather than natural causes or disease. The coroner's findings provided the evidence necessary to charge Beauregard with multiple murders. Though the legal proceedings would be complicated by the social and political climate of antebellum South Carolina, public reaction to the discovery varied sharply along lines that reflected the deep divisions of Charleston society. Many residents expressed outrage at what they viewed as Beauregard's violation of accepted standards of treatment, even within the context of slavery. However, others questioned whether legal action was appropriate for crimes committed against enslaved individuals. The Charleston Mercury published editorials arguing that while Beauregard's methods were regrettable, they did not constitute murder under existing law, since the victims were considered property rather than persons with legal rights. The legal proceedings began in August 1847, but were hampered by the difficulties of prosecuting crimes against enslaved individuals. South Carolina law provided limited protections for enslaved people, and the precedents for prosecuting their owners were sparse and contradictory. Beauregard's defense attorney, prominent Charleston lawyer James Pettigrew, argued that his client's actions, while extreme, were within the legal rights of property ownership. The prosecution, led by solicitor Isaac Hayne, contended that the systematic nature of Beauregard's operation constituted criminal behavior regardless of the victim's legal status. Testimony during the trial revealed additional details about the operation of Magnolia Grove. Former overseer Marcus Webb provided crucial evidence about Beauregard's instructions regarding the quarters and his insistence on secrecy about certain activities. Dr. Moreau testified about Beauregard's deteriorating mental state and his obsessive behavior regarding sounds from underground. Most compelling was testimony from surviving residents of the quarters, who described years of intimidation, threats, and the disappearance of individuals who were taken to the underground chambers and never seen again. The trial also exposed the broader network that had enabled Beauregard's operation. Evidence revealed connections to ship captains who regularly docked at private wharves along the Ashley River, accepting human cargo for transport to markets where no questions were asked about origin or legal status. Bank records showed payments to Beauregard from sources in Havana, New Orleans, and other ports where demand for enslaved labor exceeded legal supply channels. The scope of these connections suggested that Magnolia Grove served as one station in a larger system of illegal trafficking. Despite compelling evidence, the trial ended inconclusively. Beauregard's mental condition had deteriorated to the point where he was declared incompetent to stand trial. Legal proceedings were suspended indefinitely, and he was committed to the South Carolina Lunatic Asylum in Columbia, where he remained until his death in 1853. The charges against him were never formally resolved, leaving the case in legal limbo that reflected the broader contradictions of a society struggling with the moral and legal implications of slavery. The fate of Magnolia Grove itself became a matter of protracted legal dispute. With Beauregard declared incompetent and no clear heirs, the property fell into the hands of Charleston County administrators. The surviving residents of the quarters were distributed among other plantations in the area, though records of their specific placements have not survived. The underground chambers were filled with soil and sealed, but the buildings above ground remained standing, gradually falling into disrepair as legal battles over ownership continued through the 1850s. Local residents reported strange occurrences at the abandoned plantation in the years following the trial. Neighbors complained of sounds emanating from the sealed quarters during nighttime hours, described as scratching, tapping, and what some characterized as muffled voices. These reports led to several unofficial investigations by curiosity seekers and local officials, but no evidence of current activity was ever found. The sounds were generally attributed to settling foundations, wildlife, or the effects of wind and weather on deteriorating structures. The physical evidence of Beauregard's operation was systematically destroyed during the 1850s. County officials ordered the underground chambers filled with concrete and the entire quarters complex demolished in 1856. The official justification was public safety, as the deteriorating buildings were deemed structurally unsound. However, correspondence between county officials suggests that the decision was motivated by desire to eliminate physical reminders of events that reflected poorly on Charleston society. The bricks from the demolished chambers were reportedly used in the construction of a new courthouse, though this detail was never officially confirmed. Documentation related to the case was scattered among various county offices and private collections, making comprehensive research difficult for subsequent investigators. The coroner's complete report was archived in county records, but access was restricted by court order. Sheriff Pinckney's investigative notes were transferred to state authorities and subsequently lost during the Civil War. Dr. Moreau's medical records remained in private possession until their discovery decades later. This fragmentation of evidence ensured that the full scope of Beauregard's operation remained unclear for generations. The Civil War brought further complications to understanding the events at Magnolia Grove. Charleston's occupation by Union forces resulted in the seizure and destruction of many local records. The plantation property itself was confiscated and sold to pay Confederate debts, but the new owners found the land difficult to work due to persistent drainage problems attributed to the sealed underground chambers. Several attempts at cultivation failed, and the property was eventually abandoned to natural reclamation by the Ashley River's changing course. Interest in the case revived during the 1890s, when historian Edmund Ruffin began researching antebellum plantation practices for what would become his comprehensive study of South Carolina agriculture. Ruffin's investigation led to the rediscovery of Dr. Moreau's records and several previously unknown documents in private collections. His research revealed additional details about Beauregard's background, including evidence that he had operated similar facilities in Virginia before moving to Charleston. However, Ruffin's planned publication was never completed due to his death in 1898. The most significant rediscovery occurred in 1923, when renovation of the old Charleston County Courthouse revealed a cache of documents sealed behind a false wall. These papers included detailed maps of the Magnolia Grove underground chambers, inventory lists of transferred individuals, and correspondence with ship captains and foreign buyers. The documents provided the clearest evidence yet of the systematic nature of Beauregard's trafficking operation and its connection to broader illegal networks operating throughout the antebellum South. Analysis of these documents by historians at the College of Charleston revealed that Beauregard's operation had processed an estimated 200 individuals over 9 years. The records showed careful attention to selecting victims who were unlikely to be missed, people purchased as individuals rather than families, those with no local connections, and individuals described in the documents as unattached units. The systematic nature of this selection process suggested planning and forethought that contradicted claims that Beauregard's actions resulted from mental instability. The documents also revealed the existence of other similar operations throughout South Carolina and neighboring states. References in Beauregard's correspondence mentioned facilities near Savannah, Georgia, and Wilmington, North Carolina, operating under the supervision of associates whose names appeared in coded references. Federal investigators attempted to trace these connections during the 1920s, but most of the individuals mentioned in the documents had died decades earlier, and physical evidence of other facilities had been destroyed or lost. Modern archaeological investigation of the former Magnolia Grove site began in 1957, when the College of Charleston received permission to conduct excavations as part of a broader study of plantation archaeology. Initial surveys located the foundations of the original quarters and confirmed the existence of the sealed underground chambers. However, the concrete fill installed in 1856 proved impenetrable with available technology, preventing detailed examination of the spaces where so many people had been confined. Ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted in 1961 provided clearer images of the chamber network's layout and confirmed the accuracy of the maps found in 1923. The surveys revealed additional chambers that had not appeared in the original documents, suggesting that Beauregard's construction project had been even more extensive than previously known. Estimates based on these findings suggested that the underground network could have housed up to 60 people simultaneously, far exceeding previous calculations. The archaeological work also uncovered evidence of the rapid destruction that followed Beauregard's arrest. Layers of burned material and broken pottery suggested that personal belongings and other evidence had been deliberately destroyed before official investigations could catalogue them. Analysis of soil samples revealed traces of human remains in areas beyond the known burial site, indicating that the full extent of deaths at Magnolia Grove had never been determined. Public interest in the case increased during the 1960s, as the civil rights movement prompted re-examination of historical injustices. Several documentaries and academic studies explored the events at Magnolia Grove as an example of the extreme brutalities that slavery could enable. However, these investigations were hampered by the continued inaccessibility of key evidence and the reluctance of some institutions to provide full access to historical records that reflected poorly on regional history. The most recent investigation began in 1968, when historian Margaret Williams received access to previously restricted files in the South Carolina Department of Archives and History. Williams' research uncovered additional correspondence related to the case, including letters from federal investigators who had attempted to trace the broader trafficking network during the 1860s. These documents revealed that Beauregard's operation was one component of an extensive system that had operated throughout the antebellum period, moving people illegally between states and to foreign markets. Williams' findings suggested that the true scope of Beauregard's crimes had been deliberately obscured by officials who feared that full disclosure would expose the involvement of prominent individuals and institutions. Bank records showed that several Charleston financial institutions had facilitated payments related to the trafficking operation, while shipping records indicated that legitimate businesses had provided transportation services without adequate oversight of their human cargo. The site of Magnolia Grove remains largely undisturbed today, overgrown by decades of natural reclamation. The Ashley River's course has shifted over time, placing portions of the former plantation underwater. Local residents occasionally report finding artifacts during construction projects or farming activities, fragments of pottery, metal objects, and occasionally pieces of brick bearing the distinctive mortar used in Beauregard's underground chambers. These discoveries serve as physical reminders of events that official records can never fully document. Recent soil studies have confirmed the presence of elevated levels of phosphorus and other minerals consistent with long-term human habitation in areas corresponding to the underground chambers. These findings provide scientific corroboration for historical accounts and suggest that detailed archaeological investigation might yield additional information about the operation's scope and methods. However, such investigation would require extensive funding and careful consideration of the ethical implications of disturbing what amounts to a mass grave site. The legal precedent established by Beauregard's case influenced subsequent prosecutions related to slavery crimes, though the ultimate failure to achieve conviction demonstrated the limitations of antebellum justice systems. Legal scholars have noted that while the case represented an early attempt to apply criminal law to extreme abuses within slavery, the inability to secure conviction revealed the fundamental contradictions of a system that treated human beings as property while attempting to regulate their treatment through law. Educational institutions have used the Magnolia Grove case as a framework for examining the broader context of slavery and human trafficking in American history. The systematic nature of Beauregard's operation provides clear evidence that such activities were not isolated incidents, but components of larger criminal networks that operated with varying degrees of official tolerance. The case demonstrates how individual criminal behavior could exploit and extend existing systems of oppression. The psychological impact of discovery and investigation has been documented in the testimonies of those who participated in uncovering the evidence. County Coroner Gibbies wrote in his personal diary about nightmares that plagued him for years after examining the underground chambers. Sheriff Pinckney's family noted that he never spoke of the case in detail, though he was observed to become agitated when passing the abandoned plantation site. Dr. Moreau's later writings included references to the moral contamination that he felt resulted from his treatment of Beauregard, knowing what the man had done while appearing to seek medical help. The broader community response to the case evolved over time, reflecting changing social attitudes and historical understanding. Initial reactions focused on Beauregard as an individual aberration, but later analysis recognized the systematic factors that had enabled his operation. Modern historians emphasize the case as evidence of how existing institutions could be exploited to enable extreme abuse, rather than viewing it as an isolated example of individual evil. Documentation challenges have persisted throughout all investigations of the case. The deliberate destruction of evidence, loss of records during the Civil War, and restriction of access to surviving documents have created gaps in knowledge that may never be filled. Oral traditions within the African American community preserved some information that official records omitted, but these accounts were not systematically collected until decades after the events occurred. The question of how many similar operations existed remains unanswered. References in Beauregard's correspondence suggest a network of associated facilities, but most physical evidence has been destroyed or lost. Federal investigators during Reconstruction identified several suspicious sites, but lacked resources for comprehensive investigation. Modern researchers have identified patterns in missing person reports and property records that suggest systematic trafficking operations in multiple locations, but definitive evidence remains elusive. Current understanding of the case continues to evolve as new analytical techniques become available. Computer modeling of the underground chamber network has provided insights into construction methods and capacity that were not possible with earlier investigative techniques. Chemical analysis of artifacts has revealed information about diet, health, and living conditions that supplements historical accounts. However, the fundamental questions about the full scope of Beauregard's operation and its connections to broader trafficking networks remain partially unanswered. The transformation of the Magnolia Grove site from active plantation to abandoned ruin to archaeological investigation site reflects broader changes in how American society confronts its historical legacy of slavery. Early attempts to suppress or minimize the significance of discoveries there gave way to growing recognition of the case's importance for understanding the full range of slavery's manifestations. Current approaches emphasize the importance of preserving and interpreting such sites as educational resources, while respecting their significance as places where real people suffered and died. Environmental factors have influenced the preservation and investigation of physical evidence at the site. The Ashley River's periodic flooding has deposited layers of sediment that both protect and obscure archaeological remains. Changes in agricultural practices and development patterns have affected the integrity of subsurface evidence. Climate change and sea level rise pose additional challenges for long-term preservation of coastal archaeological sites. The relationship between historical documentation and archaeological evidence continues to provide insights into the events at Magnolia Grove. Written records describe the construction and use of underground chambers, but physical evidence reveals details about living conditions, health and mortality that contemporary sources omitted or deliberately concealed. The combination of documentary and material evidence provides a more complete picture than either source could offer alone. Legal and ethical questions surrounding the investigation and interpretation of slavery sites remain active areas of debate. Questions about ownership of recovered artifacts, appropriate methods for investigating burial sites, and the rights of descendant communities to participate in research decisions reflect broader issues in historical archaeology. The Magnolia Grove case has contributed to developing protocols for respectful investigation of sites associated with traumatic historical events. International comparisons have placed Beauregard's operation within the broader context of global human trafficking during the 19th century. Similar patterns of concealment, systematic abuse, and illegal transportation existed in other regions where slavery was legal or tolerated. The Charleston case provides detailed documentation that illuminates common features of trafficking operations that often left minimal historical traces. The role of individual agency within systems of oppression has been a focus of recent historical analysis of the case. While Beauregard clearly bears responsibility for the crimes committed at Magnolia Grove, his operation depended on the participation or complicity of ship captains, financial institutions, local officials, and others who enabled the trafficking network. Understanding how individual choices contributed to systematic abuse provides insights relevant to contemporary anti-trafficking efforts. Educational approaches to teaching the history of Magnolia Grove have evolved to emphasize both the specific details of Beauregard's operation and its broader historical significance. Rather than presenting the case as an isolated example of individual evil, current interpretations place it within the context of institutional slavery and systematic dehumanization. This approach helps students understand how extreme abuse could occur within legal and social systems that many people considered normal and acceptable. The influence of the Magnolia Grove case on subsequent historical research has been substantial, establishing methodological approaches for investigating systematic abuse within slavery that have been applied to other cases. The combination of documentary research, archaeological investigation, and community oral history that characterized study of the case has become a model for examining other sites where official records provide incomplete or deliberately misleading information. Preservation challenges for the physical site continue to require active management and planning. The underground chambers remain sealed and inaccessible, but surface features require protection from development pressure and environmental degradation. The site's significance for understanding American slavery history must be balanced against practical considerations of cost, accessibility, and educational value. The psychological and emotional impact of learning about events at Magnolia Grove extends beyond academic research to affect community understanding and historical memory. For descendants of enslaved people, the case provides specific documentation of experiences that family traditions may have preserved in general terms. For the broader community, it demonstrates the importance of examining historical events that previous generations preferred to ignore or forget. Recent technological advances have opened new possibilities for investigation of the sealed underground chambers without destructive excavation. Non-invasive imaging techniques may eventually allow detailed examination of spaces that have been inaccessible since 1856. Such investigation could provide new information about construction methods, use patterns, and possibly additional evidence about the people who were confined there. The question of memorialization remains unresolved. Unlike some historical sites associated with traumatic events, Magnolia Grove has no formal monument or interpretive facility. Proposals for memorial development must balance historical significance with respect for victims and consideration of descendant community preferences. The site's relative isolation and environmental sensitivity add practical complications to any memorial planning. Contemporary relevance of the case extends beyond historical interest to provide insights applicable to modern anti-trafficking efforts. The systematic methods that Beauregard used to identify, isolate and exploit vulnerable individuals reflect patterns that continue in contemporary trafficking operations. Understanding how such systems operated in the past can inform current prevention and intervention strategies. The incomplete nature of historical records related to Magnolia Grove reflects broader patterns in slavery documentation. Official records often omitted or minimized information about the experiences of enslaved people, while private correspondence and personal accounts provide partial insights that must be carefully interpreted. The case demonstrates both the value and limitations of different types of historical sources for understanding systematic oppression. Research efforts during the 1960s established that at least 47 individuals could be definitively documented as victims of Beauregard's operation, though the actual number was certainly higher. Names recovered from various sources included people from Virginia, North Carolina, and Georgia, suggesting that the trafficking network extended far beyond South Carolina's borders. Most victims were young adults, between 18 and 30 years of age, selected for their physical capacity and lack of local family connections that might prompt searches for missing persons. The final official investigation closed in 1969 when the South Carolina Department of Archives and History completed its comprehensive review of all surviving documentation. The department's report concluded that while significant questions about the case remained unanswered, further investigation was unlikely to yield additional substantial evidence. The report recommended that the site be designated as a historical landmark and protected from development, though this recommendation was not immediately implemented. Local folklore surrounding the abandoned plantation site persisted well into the 20th century. Residents of nearby communities passed down stories about sounds emanating from the sealed chambers, though these accounts were generally dismissed by officials as products of imagination and local superstition. However, construction workers involved in 1950s development projects in the area reported discovering fragments of brick and mortar that matched materials used in Beauregard's underground chambers, suggesting that the network extended beyond the areas that had been officially mapped and sealed. The case influenced broader historical understanding of slavery's variations and extremes throughout the antebellum South. Rather than viewing Beauregard's operation as an isolated aberration, historians came to recognize it as an example of how existing legal and social systems could be exploited to enable systematic abuse. The documentation associated with Magnolia Grove provided rare detailed evidence of trafficking networks that typically left minimal historical traces. Modern descendants of the region's enslaved population have worked to preserve memory of the events at Magnolia Grove through community education and advocacy for proper memorialization. Several families have identified ancestors who may have been among Beauregard's victims, though definitive documentation remains limited. These efforts have emphasized the importance of remembering individual victims rather than focusing solely on the systematic aspects of the operation. The site itself remains largely undisturbed, protected by its isolation and the environmental challenges posed by changing river patterns and coastal erosion. Occasional archaeological surveys have confirmed the continued presence of subsurface features related to the original plantation, but no major excavation projects have been undertaken since the 1960s. The sealed chambers remain inaccessible, preserving whatever evidence they might still contain. Legal scholars have continued to examine the case for its implications regarding justice and accountability within oppressive systems. The failure to achieve conviction in Beauregard's case reflected the fundamental contradictions of attempting to prosecute crimes against people who were legally considered property. This analysis has informed contemporary discussions about transitional justice and the challenges of addressing systematic human rights violations. The transformation of historical understanding regarding Magnolia Grove mirrors broader changes in how American society confronts its legacy of slavery. Early attempts to minimize or suppress knowledge of the case gave way to recognition of its significance for understanding the full range of slavery's manifestations. Current approaches emphasize the importance of preserving such sites as educational resources while respecting their significance as places where real people suffered and died. Environmental monitoring of the site continues to reveal information about past activities and current preservation challenges. Soil studies have confirmed elevated phosphorus levels consistent with long-term human habitation, while changes in groundwater patterns have raised concerns about the stability of the sealed underground chambers. These findings demonstrate the ongoing relevance of the site for both historical research and environmental science. The incomplete nature of historical documentation related to Magnolia Grove serves as a reminder of how much information about slavery experiences has been lost or deliberately destroyed. Official records focused on property and legal matters, while often omitting details about the human experiences of enslaved people. The case demonstrates both the value of surviving documentation and the limitations of incomplete historical records. Educational institutions continue to use the Magnolia Grove case as a framework for examining the broader context of slavery and human trafficking. The systematic nature of Beauregard's operation provides clear evidence that such activities were not isolated incidents, but components of larger networks that operated with varying degrees of official tolerance. The case demonstrates how individual criminal behavior could exploit and extend existing systems of oppression. The question of how to appropriately memorialize the site remains under discussion among historians, community representatives, and preservation specialists. Any memorial development must balance historical significance with respect for victims and consideration of descendant community preferences. The site's environmental sensitivity and relative isolation add practical complications to memorial planning. Recent advances in non-invasive archaeological techniques may eventually allow detailed examination of the sealed underground chambers without destructive excavation. Such investigation could provide new information about construction methods, use patterns, and possibly additional evidence about the people who were confined there. However, such work would require careful ethical consideration and substantial financial resources. The legacy of Magnolia Grove extends beyond its historical significance to influence contemporary understanding of systematic oppression and resistance. The case provides documented evidence of both the extreme brutality that slavery could enable and the efforts of individuals to expose and confront such abuse. This dual legacy continues to inform discussions about historical memory and social justice. As of 1969, when the final official investigation concluded, the case of Magnolia Grove remained a stark reminder of the capacity for systematic cruelty within legal frameworks that denied fundamental human rights. The sealed chambers beneath the former slave quarters continue to hold their secrets, while the Ashley River slowly reclaims the land where so many people suffered and died. The sound that still echoes across the abandoned plantation is not supernatural, but the weight of documented history and the voices of those who demanded that these events not be forgotten. The story of Silas Beauregard and Magnolia Grove serves as testament to both the depths of human cruelty and the persistence of those who refuse to let such cruelty remain hidden. In the end, the truth emerged not through official investigation alone, but through the courage of individuals who recognized that some secrets are too terrible to keep and some voices too important to silence.